All right. I want to open up with a question. How do you know that you are winning? Depends on the context, you'd probably say. If it's a game, most games have points, right? Some kind of victory point system. Sometimes it's strategic, like chess, where it's not really about points and material, but do you complete the objective? How do you know you're winning in sports? Similarly, points. Most are kind of like achieve this thing and you add it to enough. What about finances? How do you know you're winning? It's kind of like points, right? Number goes bigger, but I'd argue maybe in finances, it's a lot more about maybe peace, right? Contentment, maybe some quality of life. What about in relationships? How do you know you're winning? Well, it's kind of like points, right? You have to have at least a few friends, right? But it's also way more about the quality of those friendships, right? The people you can depend on and talk to. What about raising children? Again, points, right? You have to have enough. The Washers, I think, are winning right now with 5 kids, right? Maybe the Fozzie. But it's not about just accumulation. You have to have some kids in order to parent, but you also have to have the quality of maybe your kids being raised to maturity, right? Independence, living, right? There, you can see there's some objectives that come to mind. Now, how do you know you're winning as a church? Right? There's something that we should see an accumulation of, some kind of points, but way more importantly is the quality of the thing that we want to produce. And I would argue that is a faithfulness to replication of Christ-like disciples. That if we are a faithful church, what we should see eventually, right? I'm not saying that it's all dependent on us. I'm putting a lot of credit to the Lord, right? But the idea being, at some point, we should see a faithful replication of Christ in somebody else. And so that's what I hope to talk about today. And so just laying out my goals, I want to kind of paint a specific target of what we're trying to achieve, not just as our church, but as the church general, right? I want to demonstrate that through principles of discipleship, seen both in the Gospels and Jesus' ministry, and even how the disciples after Jesus, right, the apostles and Paul, used these same principles in their ministry, showing that this is something that's not just unique to Jesus' time. And then finally, I want to brainstorm. I'm going to throw out a lot of examples of how this might apply to our church, but my hope is that you, as an individual, can say, what ministry am I involved in, and how might I apply some of these discipleship principles? And here's why I think making a definition is important. Often when you throw around, what is discipleship, you'll notice that discipleship isn't in the Bible. The word discipleship is not a word that's used. So people can feel free to define it in many different ways. And so if we want to define it biblically, people do go different ways to do that. One is the word disciple in Greek is mathetes, which just simply means learner. But to call somebody a disciple who is merely a learner, right, if that's the only thing that being a disciple is, you're missing something. This is what we call an etymological fallacy. My wife is a very nice person. And if you know what I just said in etymological fallacy, nice just means in nessus, right, Latin, it means the person who's ignorant, right? You should slap me right now if that's what I meant, right? Nice, we know, doesn't no longer mean somebody who's ignorant or not knowing, but probably somebody who's kind and generous, right? So when we say mathetes is a learner, we don't want to just simply define it that way because that might not be how the word was used. Context is king in the Bible when it comes to how people define things. In the Gospel of Luke, he calls people disciples who Matthew does not call disciples. So we want to have a keen eye of what we're defining here. Some people go to the word follower. We get this from Acts 24, right? Followers of the way. You can even see some Old Testament roots coming into here. I would even argue that when we have the word Christian used in the first time in Acts 11, you kind of have a similar thing, right? The first time that disciples are called Christian, meaning little Christ, there's an element in which being a disciple is following. Now, obviously, we don't have Jesus physically present, so it seems to be a following in his teachings and his patterns. And there's something to that, but also discipleship includes something about being sent. They can't just follow. They don't follow forever. Jesus commissions disciples. Disciples commission other people. So there's an element that's missing still there. One who is under discipline. Well, if one who's under discipline, disciple, right? Same Greek word, or same root here. Then we're missing another piece. The monks are probably the most disciples, if that's what we want to go, right? Somebody who's under complete discipline of prayer. And again, I would say that there's an element of truth in all of these aspects. But we have what I would like to call the chocolate chip cookie problem. Tell me, what's the most important element of a chocolate chip cookie? Really? Have you ever tried chocolate chip cookies without flour? Without sugar? We had some amazing chocolate chip cookies here. I think Candy made them, right? Steve couldn't eat enough of them in the back when we had the women's tea, right? And they were amazing, probably because they had lots of elements to them, not just chocolate chips, right? Flour, sugar, eggs. Like if you take one of these ingredients out, you're missing something. To put it in more theological terms, if I were to stand up here and give a whole sermon on the humanity of Jesus, and I were to spend 30 minutes going into all the ways that we knew he was a human, and I didn't say anything else, you'd feel really awkward by the end. Because you'd say, I'm missing something, right? Was Jesus a human? Did I say anything wrong? No. But if I never said he was fully God, you know I'm missing something. And so when we say, what is discipleship? Here's my humble attempt to try to capture all the pieces of it. There's a sermon outline in the back if you want, in the bulletin, to try to capture all these elements. So here's my humble proposal of a definition. That discipleship is the life-on-life process by which a person may mature into the image of Christ. That would be the one sentence. To go further into what that process looks like, this process includes calling, committed following, hands-on training, testing, and commissioning unto Christ-like replication. And so I hope to go through these rather quickly. I'm going to try to show examples of it and all the principles. Let me encourage that these are principles, so there's going to be specific elements. Don't worry, the definition, we're literally just going to go through it all over there. So if you're worried about writing it all down, we're going to go through it slide by slide. All right, so first step. Discipleship is the life-on-life process. Within this shared life of discipleship, one of the first elements is simple observation. When we get to the Gospels, you see Jesus appointing those who will be his apostles, and the next thing he does after he appoints them is they watch. They don't do anything. That there's a long period of time, some shorter than others, that they just watch Jesus do ministry. That they're not expected to answer questions. They just show up. So discipleship has to have an application of just being there. In Acts 20 and throughout the book of Acts, you see a pattern of Paul doesn't do mission trips by himself. He makes a very pointed effort to bring people with him. Now you could say, well, they're useful for the purpose of the ministry. Was Paul able to do ministry? I think he was pretty good at it, right? But he made a point to bring people along who almost don't do anything. You even see it when we credit his letters, that when he writes letters, we attribute them to Paul, but many of them, look at the beginning, they're attributed to Timothy in there, Silas, right? There's people that are part of the letter writing process. That there has to be a stage where they're just being there and observing. But with that observation comes the natural next step of explanation. As my daughter follows us around, right? If you've had kids, they like to ask questions, right? Discipleship's kind of built into the family model because they're right there. And so when things happen they have questions about, they ask. And I love that the explanations come in different forms. For Jesus, it's in the parables. You see this, that the crowds get a full-on parable, but when disciples come afterwards, they say, teach us this parable. In 13, Jesus says, bless the socks off of you. It's the Samuel translation. Because you have asked for information that you didn't have before. And even when they didn't understand, Jesus gives 3 more parables to the crowds. They go inside a house, right? And they explain more parables. And the disciples even get 3 more parables than the rest of the crowds do, so that they would understand. Because by the end of Matthew 13, Jesus asks, did you understand these things? And they say, yes, right? That explanation leads to understanding. You see Paul addressing specific questions that the Corinthian church had, right? Concerning things like sexual immorality, things like spiritual gifts, meat sacrifice to idols, and how to do offerings. That his letter is a direct response to the questions that they have doing ministry, doing life on life kind of things. But this explanation and observation, all these are part of Access, doesn't come unless you have a family-like community. I want to just read for you a section of 1 Timothy because I think it captures the family-like community that should be involved in any Christian ministry church. So chapter 2, verse 7, he says, but we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children, so affectionately longing for you. We were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. And you remember, brethren, our labor and toil, for laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. We preach to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how devoted and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believe. As you know, how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father does his own children, that you would walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. You see, in just this short section, Paul compares himself to a mother with a nursing child, right? The affection and comfort that comes with that. He also compares himself to brethren, right? A peer relationship, and also as one who is a father, reprimanding his children so that they might grow and be exhorted to walk worthy of their calling. This family-like community isn't something that's just a static relationship, but it shows the commitment, right? How committed are you to your family? How committed to you are your own children, right? That's the kind of commitment that discipleship has, but also the safety that comes with a family-like community. You can tell your family things that you don't tell other people often, right? That there's an intimacy that comes with, this is what's really happening in my life. And you don't get that unless you have community to be open and shared. It doesn't exclude confrontation, though. Just because it's a safe place to say, hey, I did this thing, or this is what I'm thinking, it also needs to be the kind of place where there's confrontation. That's a really bad idea. It comes out of my mouth often with my kids, right? And sometimes people don't just need like rubber stamping, yes, that's good ideas. Sometimes they need confrontation. One of my first sermons that I gave here after I was done preaching, Steve stood right there and he said, a couple things to help me wrap up because it was a little loose on the application. And after everyone dismissed, we stepped to the side and he goes, you can't say that. He corrected one of the things that I gave as an application. And I thank him for it because that's the kind of relationship. If people just say, you're doing a great job all the time, you realize maybe our egos are too high, but we don't actually do a good job all the time. We don't say all the right things or the most precise way. We need confrontation in our lives. And so I would encourage you, if you consider yourself to be a disciple, we have to welcome that as part of the process, whether you agree or not. Finally, that the family-like example has examples that when you do things life on life, that there are patterns to follow, not just in the character of a person, but also in the actions and steps. Part of why I loved having a work day here is because we can actually share life together. I remember asking Mike Jr. when doing the ice machine, do you mind? I didn't have anyone specific in mind, but do you mind if I find somebody that wants to learn, from you, to walk and kind of learn those things? And he said to me, and I appreciated this, he goes, I am willing, but that will change the assignment. Because he caught it, right? It's no longer about an ice machine right now. It's also the process of how do we train up this person. And I was thrilled to have these kind of events, a workday, because it puts people next to each other in frustrating situations, right? When you have tension or frustration, you see somebody's character come out. Character isn't there until there's a problem, right? When there's a tension, right? We're waking up early this morning and Indigo has a massive blowout and we're like trying to get out of church on time, right? I was squeezed. I was realizing my attitude and my tensions are wrong here. So in the family-like context, my children get to watch how am I going to respond? What's more important, getting to church on time or my kids, right? But character comes out when you're squeezed. And you don't get to see that example in other people unless you're doing life-on-life stuff, unless you're doing a ministry together. This is why by design, you can't have programs in the church. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm all for programs. But you can't just set programs and print off disciples like they're a copy machine, right? All the programs in the world won't do it unless there's a person placed there. The people that are going to actually be replicatable, that their example in their lives, not just in their actions, but in their character. So this community, if you want to have it be a safe environment, must be defended from threats. First, you get some external threats. When the disciples are dining and eating with sinners and tax collectors, this is something that they wouldn't normally do. Matthew is just called to follow Jesus, and guess who asks the question? The Pharisees. They come to the disciples and say, why does your master sit with sinners and tax collectors? It's an awkward moment because they don't necessarily have an answer, but guess who steps in? Jesus. It says that the Pharisees asked the disciples and that Jesus answered the question. Most likely they're in the early stages of their maturity, and Jesus is the one who steps in. You see this also in the epistles, like in 2 John, where he warns against these threats that are coming from the outside. Don't welcome into your door lest you participate with them. But these threats aren't just external. They sometimes come internal as well. Jesus confronts his disciples. He's not afraid to call out problems with them. We also see that there's going to be people at the last day that say, Lord, Lord, did we not do all these things in your name? And Jesus will say, I never knew you. Jude warns them also, saying that there's deceptive teachers that have come into their midst. What I love about both these examples, both Jesus and Jude, they don't say, and you will know them by your false teaching. It says you'll know them by their fruits, or in Jude, by their character. That when we want to create a safe environment for discipleship, we have to make sure that the right doctrine is being taught and that we are protecting against those external and internal threats. If you don't have a safe place to disciple, people won't be willing to open up about what's really going on in their lives. Some other examples that I throw out there, all these assume that there's a ministry that's being participated in. If you're a parent, you have a ministry. That's your own kids. But also, it may not be something that you do just at home. It might be more visible in the church, what I would call kind of a public ministry. Maybe it's teaching. How do we, as a church and as a people, create space to have these principles involved? Things like observation and explanation. One of the biggest things you'll hear from me through this whole time is there actual space to make people do life together, to do these things? Are we inviting co-teachers? I love that in the preschool, we have a co-teacher, not just for safety reasons, but because that little, often a younger person gets to observe how the older teacher is doing the ministry, to participate in it, to help, but even just to observe and get the explanations of why do you do this activity before you do this activity? Why do you discipline the kids this way? Or how do you recorrect and, all those kind of aspects? How are there ways in which we can create more space to have that life-on-life relationship? And not just hanging out and doing fellowship and coffee. I love a one-on-one coffee date, just like any bit of you, but you'll notice Jesus doesn't have a one-on-one coffee date with many of his disciples. He does have the 12, and he does have the inner 3. But beyond that, he never has the one-on-one boat ride with Peter. That discipleship, sometimes it's better to have it in small group or larger group settings. And so instead of trying to get one-on-one time with every single person you want to disciple, maybe instead of thinking, how do I get relational time with this person, maybe you need to think, what ministries are either they or I involved in that we can participate in that together? Now, I don't want to forsake the family-like aspect of that, right? Family is good to have just downtime where you're relating to each other. Similarly with discipleship, you should just have relational time. I'm hoping that the fellowship meal afterwards is just a great time of fellowship where there's not a checked box of things to get done. But if you want to invest in somebody, maybe consider what ministry you can be a part of and invite somebody into that. Similarly, if you're leading or hosting an event, it's really easy, and I'm guilty of this like anybody, to just do the event, to just plan it and to just do the thing. It's harder and it takes more work and more time to invite people into the process of doing ministry. But maybe there's a way that when we're doing, hospital trips or mercy ministry, I'm just throwing out examples, to bring somebody with you to say, here's how I do it. Not as a perfect model, but just here's how it looks like, so that we can ask those questions and observation. All right, that's my longest point. Don't worry, we're going to speed through some of these. All right, so discipleship is the life-on-life process by which a person may mature. In my mind, the doctrine of sanctification and discipleship are intrinsically linked. That a person is not sanctified apart from the life that God has given in the community of God to be discipled by another person. While there's many avenues in which a person grows in their sanctification, it's not apart from the community. Even when it comes to prayer and Bible reading, those are part of people in your life that teach you how to do those things and guide your heart. In that sanctification process, you see one aspect of a training for ministry, kind of an external and an internal, the heart character. In their sanctification, there's an external ministry. You see Jesus sends out his disciples to do the exact same ministry that he did. Even later on in the book of Matthew, that when they're on the Mount of Transfiguration, they come back down, and the disciples are doing the same ministry. There's an expectation of an active participation in ministry that they're commissioned to do. This is also where it's important to note that this is a model, not a mold, that we're not going to do the exact same ministry that Jesus did of healing and those kind of things, but that there's an example of caring for people that needs to come out from this. Why I'm so passionate about sanctification having to have kind of an aspect where it helps other people is I think that's the model you see in the church. Jesus could have done many things to prove his identity as the full Son of God, but he chose miracles. He chose to help people. You see this also carried out in the church. When they have an issue with being able to feed, help the widows in the church, The apostles didn't say, well, to make sure that we focus on prayer and ministry, or prayer and preaching of the word, we're going to forget these people. They said, no, it's part of our identity as a church to make sure that we appoint people, deacons in that case, to make sure that this ministry goes on. And I would argue that your sanctification isn't growing unless you have a heart and care for people, some kind of tangible, physical, and spiritual good for another. But we're not just concerned in sanctification about the externals of what you do. We're also concerned about the heart. Later on in Jesus' ministry with the disciples, he's not afraid to confront them, specifically the Pharisees, that their external is good and they're trying to do things, but their heart is wicked and that they need to change. They've traded the wrong thing. Jesus also confronts the disciples that say, we want to sit in your left and right hand. He's like, if you want that, you're going to have to enter in with humility and service. That disciples should be distinguished by humility and service to all. That apart from that heart change, that there's a part in which that their heart is not correct yet. So, external in sanctification, ministries, internal, heart and attitude. There's a very key word here in this definition, the word may. You may recognize this person. I was able to dig up a more modern picture if this is helpful to you. This guy named Judas, you've probably heard of, right? He is a disciple. You can't deny that fact. The fact that he is called a disciple many times throughout the Gospels, across the Gospels, even an apostle. There's something that you have to realize, that discipleship is not a guarantee of success. Jesus batted 11 out of 12 here. And I don't think it was because Jesus was messing up. But part of the process of discipleship includes this expectation that not all are going to get it. You see this through the New Testament too, right? Hymenaeus, Alexandra, Demas, all these people who were definitely disciples, who were following the way, and even for a time Mark just weren't there. And so as we do ministry that cares for people, as we do life on life, there's an expectation that this isn't just up to us, that this is the Lord's work, and that ultimately it's him who does the work. And so it might be a little disheartening that says, you're going to put all this effort into somebody, all this life into somebody, and then they're just going to walk away. But one, you don't know the end of the story. There's a little bit of that truth in there. But two, it's also very freeing. If discipleship is dependent on me, then failure and success also is dependent on me. There's a lot of freedom that says, God's called us just to be faithful in this process. So this isn't a sermon of legalism that's going to try to say, like, how we're going to whip us into shape or how to do this in our lives. This is to saying, what's the next step of faithfulness look like for me, for us? How might we better mature? And that maturity is into something specific as we're defining our target. It's into the image of Christ. Here's why I picked that. Within the Imago Dei, the concept of being made in the image of God, there's a couple different ideas, or how are we made in the image of God? And if discipleship is supposed to be made into the image of God, then it's worth talking about these things. One idea you've probably heard most commonly is the structural view. It's the idea that man has similar characteristics of God, right? We're made logical beings, that we're artistic, that we have a sense of justice like God. Another view is that we're functionally in the image of God. The idea of functional is seen right there in the passage of Genesis 1, where we get the concept of Imago Dei, where it says that they are to rule and to reign, or that they're going to have dominion over the earth. The problem I have with that view is that if we're only in the image of God when we're ruling and reigning or showing dominion over the earth, then we could lose the image of God. And it kind of takes away kind of the sanctity of human life that we see passed on. But there's one more view of the relational view, that part of being made in the image of God, a triune God who's relational in himself, is that we relate to one another. This is also seen right in Genesis 1, where it says that he made them male and female. So to be made in the image of God is a collective act, not just an individual one. So I bring up these issues, to show that we have another chocolate chip cookie problem. That all of these are elements of what it means to be made in the image of God. And that to take out one of these parts is incomplete. Being made in the image of God is a soteriological event. That from the beginning to the end, we are being restored back into the image of what God is. This starts in discipleship process before the person believes. This starts with the unregenerate person. We've already given the example of Judas, but when the call to make disciples comes, it says, make disciples of all nations. How many disciples were there at that point? not enough, right? It also includes the activity of baptizing. And I don't care if you're an infant baptizer or a credo baptizer. If you're going to baptize, that normally means you're welcoming them into the faith, right? That if we're going to make disciples through baptizing and teaching, part of it starts with the outreach of the ministry. You see this also in John, the fact that he calls people disciples who stop following. That means that you have to be able to have life on life, not just with the believer, those who are already confessing, but with also the people who are not yet Christians, who don't get this yet. I appreciate Steve's pretty honest that some of his classes don't have Christians in it. And that means he has an opportunity, not just to disciple Christians, but to share the gospel with those people right where they're at and to be an example of them. This image doesn't stop there. It goes into justification, that we are reborn, just as John 3:16 would say. Paul would say that we are a new creation, right? That if we are in the image of God and that's fallen, marred in the sin of Adam, that when we are restored and regenerate, that we are made into the image of God again and new. That when we are believers, there's an aspect in which we reflect him already. But in the sanctification process, it says that we need to be conformed into the image of his son. In other words, it's something that hasn't yet happened. Something that our identity is in the image of God, but it's something that we, over time, need to model what this looks like. Similarly, in Colossians, it says that Christ is the image of the invisible God. So if you want to know, how do I look like Jesus, or how do I look like God, you model out your life after Jesus. How he did ministry, how he did life, that he is the goal, the standard of what it means to be sanctified. And finally, this finishes in glorification, that we'll never quite achieve it here in this life until we cross the finish line. Until heaven, there's no retirement homes for discipleship. That if we can ask the question, where in my life don't I look like Jesus yet? Then the work of sanctification of discipleship is not done yet. You see this in 1 Corinthians 15, where it talks about how the man of dust, in other words, our bodies, the imperfected parts, will become an image in heaven, of a glorified body. In Romans, it talks about how we are predestined not to go to heaven. I mean, that's part of it. But we are predestined to be conformed into the image of his son. That our goal in life, our sanctification, of all of the things we're doing in discipleship, is asking just a simple question. Where doesn't this person look like Jesus yet? Where might they have thinking that doesn't align with God? Where might their heart and their character not be aligned with his values? And where might his actions not be helping or serving to do physical and spiritual good to something else? So all of these things, the Imago Dei, are a part of how we kind of ask, what's the target of discipleship? And quite simply, when we look at Jesus, we say that he is not only our model, but he commands us that his people are also models. That if we're made in the image of God, right, if we're renewed to look like Jesus, then that means we don't just follow his example, but we follow the example that's set in place in other people. You see this principle in Luke, where a disciple becomes like those they follow, just a general truth. Paul's invitation was to imitate me as I imitate Christ. And Paul wasn't alone. I think that pattern was supposed to persist. He says in Philippians 3 that you're supposed to note those who so walk, as you have us for pattern. So it's not just Paul, the apostles, but when you want to become like Jesus, you look for somebody that says, that's a mature believer that I want to replicate and imitate. That's how you become sanctified. Now, sometimes when we say, I want to become like Christ, like Paul, the picture kind of comes like this, where you got Christ, then you got like Paul, then you got this little, right? Sometimes our imitation is imperfect, and that's why we have the necessities of the scriptures and Christ as our ultimate picture of what it looks like to follow. But I would encourage you that if you want to become a disciple of Christ, you have to become a disciple of somebody else that's made in the image of Christ and to follow in that way. And to ask the very simple and probably worn out question of what would Jesus do in this situation? And that's what it needs to look like in our own lives, if you want to be image bearers. All right, so that's the whole definition. The last part of what I want to cover is simply going into what does this process need to look like, and give lots more examples of how individually we might apply this, or also as a church. And while there's many ways that we can other in this case, where we're thinking about, oh, I wish somebody else would do this, I want you just to think about one ministry that you do, whether it's your family, whether it's something at the church, whether it's something outside the church. I want you to think through this process and say, where might I better implement this in my life? All right, so this initial step of discipleship, this process includes calling. So this is kind of the opening act, you could say, of discipleship. You have to actually call people. You see this in Jesus' ministry, where he 3 times calls Peter to more and more hard things, right? Eventually to become a fisher of men. That if we're going to be part of the process of discipleship, you have to call people who aren't ready yet. I know sometimes we're just trying to fill jobs with Sunday school or tech team, right? We're trying to find people who are ready. But if we want discipleship to actually occur, you have to call people who aren't ready yet. And I would even encourage those who might not be ready to become a Christian yet. I know that we have to be careful of how we do things, right? All those things matter. But we need to call people who aren't there yet. You see this also in Paul's writings where he says that they're called to holiness. And the Corinthian church was not holy. They were one of the worst churches. And so the fact that he's saying this is what you're called to is a reminder of saying, here's what you signed up for to become a Christian. This is also an ongoing calling. Jesus warns his disciples of the leaven of the Pharisees. He's using a metaphor to say that don't let a little bit of their teaching get in, otherwise it'll grow into a bad thing. And the disciples are like, man, we forgot bread. I don't know what we're going to do. It's kind of a humorous moment until Jesus kind of clamps down on them. Are you still without understanding? Part of the calling isn't just an initial call, but an on-calling thing of saying, you don't look like Jesus yet here. There has to be that confrontation that comes in discipleship. And if you don't look like it yet, what are we going to do? He doesn't even explain it here. Earlier, he would explain the parables in chapter 13, but now in 16, he just repeats the parable. And the beauty of it is, then they understood. That you could see their growth happening here throughout the book of Matthew. Paul also confronts false teachers over and over again. Even Peter, right, the first pope. I'm joking, right? That he confronts even another apostle to his face because he doesn't look like Jesus. He's not acting consistent yet. All right, so that calling is ongoing as well as initial. With that calling, you have to pair that with commitment. Calling somebody to be more than they are, if there's no commitment, there's not really an opportunity to see life-changing growth. Calling somebody to something good or something better is kind of like giving casual conversation to a in-law that you have over Thanksgiving. It's they might take the advice, they might not, right? But there's no follow-up. There's nothing that's going to make it concrete. That in a week we're going to follow up on this and see how we're doing on it, right? Or see what we're doing to meld the heart. And so if there's going to be commitment, it has to be sacrificial. Both an initial, you see this again with the disciples, right? Matthew gets up off the tax collector's booth right there to follow Jesus. Similar with the disciples, they leave their father, the wealth that they had there, the life, that there's a sacrificial commitment necessary to disciple. There's also an ongoing aspect of discipleship. Later on, he'll say that you have to pick up your cross daily, that this is something that's going to be a regular part of commitment. That if you're not showing up to church, if you're not doing life-on-life community, that there's no way that discipleship is truly going to happen in a meaningful way. It's one of the issues I have with larger churches where people just show up to receive the word. There's nothing wrong with hearing a good sermon and worshiping with other people, but there's a missing piece of discipleship without a communal aspect. This is also where I'd recommend things like membership. Church membership is a great way to say, here's the people who are committed, and here's what the commitment actually looks like, clearly spelling out, here's what we expect from people who are coming to the body of Christ. It's also reassuring because it's a commitment back from the church. That this isn't just saying, here's all of my commitments that I'm giving, but it's the church saying, here's how we're committing back to you as a family member. That not just what we expect, but what you should expect from us, the care, the love, and as Paul would say that those who would give watch for your soul, that there's something that they're going to be held accountable to. Paul also says that when this ongoing sacrifice, right, daily sacrifice is going to look like offering your bodies as a living sacrifice. The sanctification process, it's not going to be fun all the time. Nobody likes being confronted. But if there's the value of I don't look like Jesus yet and being confronted gets me there, then whatever confrontation that takes, it'll be worth it to look more like Christ. And that the ultimate truth is that many disciples won't want to make that commitment. And part of how you can distinguish who do I spend my time helping, teaching, spending fellowship with, is those who are actually committed. And I don't want to add arbitrary commitments. I don't want to be a legalist in that way. And I want to be gracious to those who are learning those commitments. In fact, I want to make the initial commitment as small as possible, right? Show up, observation. But later on, you recognize if church maturity goes the right way to leadership, even deacon or eldership, that there's a lot more commitments that are expected on that level, right? And it's a natural process. The initial commitment is small, and each step of your maturity says hey, you don't look like Jesus here yet. What do you need to do to make that happen? And similarly, as we're thinking those were disciples, I see this often in youth ministry. Sometimes that what was okay for my 4-year-old to do is not okay for my 10-year-old to do now, right? You know this intuitively with children, that there needs to be a maturing to eventually get out of the house and be mature, to be an adult. Let's do that with our spiritual children as well, even with each other. All right, other examples. One way that we might have this commitment or this idea of calling people is just to do evangelistic outreaches as a church. That when we know we're supposed to share the gospel, but doing a church outreach, or whether it's a festival or just going to the neighborhood sharing the gospel, doing it collectively gives opportunity for people to just observe the ministry, to watch somebody else share the gospel, to ask questions, right? Those principles. It also gives opportunity for the other person to be able to step in as they understand these things. That it also gives opportunity for commitment to say, are you ready to learn and grow these things? All right, next part. So we have calling, committed following, and hands-on training. As we're doing these outreaches, as we're doing these things, you get the opportunity to say and have a debrief with somebody. Let's say I shared the gospel with somebody. We're going to go to the next door. And I say, hey, did you observe how that question went? How did I respond when this thing happened, right? You get the opportunity to do this testing. Sorry, I'm a little ahead of myself. Hands-on training. So hands-on training, there's a demonstration that needs to happen here. Jesus not only taught his disciples, here's how we should pray, he also demonstrated it. How many times do you see Jesus praying in the Gospels? Quite often. In fact, he brings his disciples with him and says, pray with me. He wants to demonstrate what this is supposed to look like. Paul also does practice these things. He says, practice what you have learned and seen in me. In other words, if they've seen it in him, that's something they're supposed to emulate. Going back to the first Thessalonians passage, right? He says that we labored and toiled among you so that you would see in us an example. How might in your ministry you need to be demonstrating the skills that you expect of other people? How might we need to be an example first before we can expect other people to get that training? This training also includes delegation. I love the feeding of the 5,000 because the disciples are doing their job. They say, hey, Lord, there's a problem. People are kind of hungry. And they come up with a solution. We probably should send them away. And on any other boat of reasonability, right, that would be the right answer. They're doing the ministry. They're taking care of people. But Jesus tests them. He delegates to them. He says, why don't you give them something to eat, right? And in that question, they have to think of a solution. And it shows to him their heart, that they don't understand who he is yet because they can't do it. They give a solution of we're going to find all this money and, we can't do this, Lord. And Jesus doesn't rebuke them. He just says, bring what you got. Right? The beautiful example of Jesus testing and training them. And he doesn't just feed them. He hands the food to the disciples to hand the food to the crowd. In the picture there, you almost have a shepherd who hands food to under-shepherds who feeds the crowd who are sitting on grass in, groups of 50 and 100. You get a picture of discipleship almost as the caring of a flock. So delegation. Paul also has the delegation of ministry. He leaves Timothy in certain places. He not only goes with them, but he says, okay, for a short time, you're going to be here. And then later he gets delegated for a longer time over here. That the training and delegation is part of what it means to be a mature disciple. All right, and testing. I love asking questions because it tries to provoke people to think. Questions are a beautiful tool. I already gave the example of the feeding of the 5,000. Why don't you give them something to eat? We also have the beautiful moment of when Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You don't get that moment unless Jesus first asks, who do people say that I am? This wasn't information that Jesus didn't know. This is trying to test the hearts of the people. So as we're discipling, whether, again, think of whatever context of ministry you're in, personal or formal, where might we be needing more space to ask questions? To meet ahead of time, to see where people are at, to delegate with them, and also to meet afterwards, to debrief. I hope that I get lots of feedback from the sermon as an aspect of discipleship, right? Because if I'm not open to rebuke, then I'm a hypocrite, right? I want to hear feedback from these things. Also, you see Paul using questions as a rhetorical device. He could just say, y'all are sinners and need to stop doing it, but instead he asks a whole bunch of provoking questions in order to try to think for themselves. Questions are powerful in discipleship. All right, second to last here. Testing. Do we have opportunities to give people a chance to do something small? in order to see where they're at. The disciples are sent out. Part of why they're sent out in the early parts of the chapter, I believe, are a testing of their ministry, of what they've learned. And even says in Mark that they came back into brief and told Jesus all that they had done, that there's something that needed to happen in that small commissioning. Timothy is sent to Corinth, I already mentioned that one, and sent to Ephesus, that these testings are proving his character. The letter of 2 Timothy is kind of an encouragement because he's been delegated for something for a lot longer and needs encouragement in that way. That's what the junior hires are studying right now. Among this testing, you want to try to figure out where is their head not like Jesus, where is their heart not like Jesus, where is their hands not like Jesus. So do we have opportunity to demonstrate these testings? Where might there be small jobs? Think of whatever ministry you have. Where might there be small things that could be delegated or tested in them? Things that can be covered. Maybe there's a mistake, but things that are meaningful, yet able to be covered if it's not perfect yet. 1 second, catch my notes. All right, and then the last one, replication. This is where the disciple is sent out. There must be a release point of a disciple. Now, that release point does not mean there's no longer a relationship, but it does mean there's a point in sanctification where we say they're ready to do ministry on their own. That the Great Commission is a great example of that, but you also see Paul calling to Timothy, and trust the things that you've heard from me among many witnesses to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. There's a doctrinal aspect of that release. But even in the release, there's always support. Even in the Great Commission of go to all the ends of the world and make disciples, it says, surely I'm with you always. That we don't do this alone. I think back to my own training. I did an internship about 12 years ago now with my now brother-in-law. He wasn't my brother-in-law then. I'd say the internship worked out, but but during that time, I was under him. There was a very clear, I'm sitting under his teaching. I have lots of experience. I remember the first day, I had to do something that was kind of like on the humbling side, that it was just like, I'm a director back at my ministry, but I was put as just a lowly member because it was good for me. I had to see my authority structure sitting under him. After my internship, and even now, that relationship changed over time. The discipleship might start with a clear one-way giving street, but it's kind of like your children. Right? There's a clear direction which you're hoping to teach and train your kids. And eventually, if it goes well and they're mature, all of a sudden you start relating to your kids as adults now. Right? There's still a recognition of your, right, honor your father and mother, but then there's more of a peer level at some point in their growth and development. And that's what I would hope we would see in this church, Christ-like replication. You see this also with Timothy, his beloved son, and also with Titus. The instructions that he gives to them, there's a release point that they said, I left here, in these places to do this work. So again, where might in our ministries do we need to release? Release is hard. Release is good people who've been trained up in the ministry that don't get to help anymore. I am grieved and sad to see Charlton not here anymore because he was not just useful to the ministry, but a friend. When we planned the workday, I thought, man, I wish Charlton wasn't needing, he works nights since he had to sleep during the time we were here. I wish he was available because I could have really used somebody in his skill sets to do these things because I trust him as a trained, mature disciple. Similarly, when we sent Katie, right? Katie's doing what right now? Everything, anything, right? But as a mature sent disciple. And it's really hard because those are things that we could really value and like why churches tend to kind of internally focus on each other. And church multiplication is really hard. But my hope would be that we don't just internally grow because people kind of shifted from one other church or whatever, but that our growth would be from the beginning, that we see people who aren't saved come to know the Lord in our midst, grow up into maturity, and then eventually get sent out, whether that's this body growing into multiple churches or whether that's them starting something else. That's how I know that we're winning, is when we see replication, when we see a heart transformation that all revolves around the gospel. And here's the why of what we do it. And I appreciate that in Mark Dever's book about discipling, he starts with, we do this because it's the right thing to do. It's love. Yes, there's an obedience aspect of this, but we do this because we care about people. That if we truly believe that they need these tools to look like Christ, that this is going to change their life, then it's the loving thing to do to go through all the effort of dragging them and pulling them into our lives and bearing with them when they don't understand and going through this whole process. It's, again, similar to having children. You do it because you love first, not because you're supposed to. But I'd also say we have an obligation to be obedient to the Lord's command. That unless we are about the process of making disciples, helping people to look more like Christ, to do intentional physical and spiritual good in other people, that we haven't hit the mark yet. And that in that obedience, I trust that the Lord will bless the effort. Similarly, we do this because this is how we image God. Part of being an image bearer is, how did God save us? He called us. He sanctified us. He equipped us, trained us for ministry. And that in doing that process for another person, another human being, that's how we act like our Father. That's what he did for us. And that there's something about discipleship that you won't be sanctified yourself unless you participate in the action. There's a lot of ways to become a mature person, but being a parent will mature you like a lot, like that won't, right? When you're raising your children, it tests you in all the ways that you didn't want to be pushed and tested. And if you want to grow to be more like Jesus, you won't get there unless you start training and discipling somebody else. And I know that's super scary, right? It can feel like, well, I'm not qualified, I'm not ready to do that yet. And if you want to talk more personally about like what might be a barrier in that, I'm happy to talk about it. But to the degree that the Lord has changed and shaped you is to the degree that you can shape and change somebody else. And I'll just close with this. There's a lot of reasons why we should do discipleship. And part of why I'm so passionate about it is because it changed my life. This is our mission. So what role will you play in this mission? All right, let's pray. Father, we thank you that you have equipped us, that you've given us everything we need in your word and in the community to do these things. So I pray that whatever endeavor this may look like, whether that's personal ministry or something in this church, that we be about your process, to see your work done in the life of somebody else. May we be changed by that, may we be encouraged, and may we see ultimately your church grow because of the work that you do through us. Amen.
Thank you, Samuel.